After great pain, a formal feeling comes. The nerves sit ceremonious like tombs. Emily Dixon. When I wake up, I see the world's ugliest stray cat laying at my feet. He has a smashed-in nose, a snaggletooth, and goopy eyes. People in our community call him Cheddar, insisting that his unkempt orange fur resembles the cheese. Despite his rough appearance, Cheddar has a soft spot for me, curling up next to me some nights. He doesn't like my dad, though. It was a while ago, but I think he still remembers my dad throwing him out in the rain after he pissed on the carpet. I swing my legs off the bed, careful not to disturb him. My room is modest. There's a small desk in the corner, covered in books and papers, and a bed with a large quilt. The only decoration on the walls is a faded poster of a band I've never listened to. Cheddar lifts his head sleepily as I walk over to the closet. I slip on a Henley, blue jeans, and a pair of steel-toed boots. After retrieving my worn leather satchel from its spot behind the door, I snatch the ration booklet off my desk and quickly tuck it into my bag. Cheddar follows me out of the room and down the stairs, his paws pattering behind me. The smell of coffee wafts from the kitchen, mixing with the scent of fried eggs and Spam. My dad sits at the table, sipping his coffee and reading a book. "Dang it, Jay," he says with a frown. "What have I told you about letting that damn cat in?" My dad has a rough appearance, forged by a lifetime of hard work. His posture carries the weight of years spent laboring over engines, while his calloused hands bear the marks of countless engine repairs and rebuilds. The sleeves of his shirt are rolled up, revealing thin arms covered with faded tattoos. "It was cold last night," I plead, grabbing a plate and joining him at the table. "I don't care if it's colder than a brass toilet seat on the shady side of an iceberg. Let the neighbors take care of him. He can piss inside their house, not mine." "Okay," I sigh, hoping to avoid any further scolding. "I'll let him out when I leave." "Just make sure he doesn't follow you back here," he grumbles, taking a bite of his breakfast. "I don't want that mangy thing pissing on my porch." I quickly finish eating, eager to get out of the house before my dad starts up again. Snatching a beige jacket from the coat rack, I embrace its comforting warmth, then slide into a pair of leather gloves. Cheddar meows at my feet, rubbing himself against my leg, and I open the door. The frosty air greets me as I step outside, Cheddar darting out ahead of me. I smile, relieved that at least one thing is going smoothly today. In our corner of the base, the air hangs heavy with ash, especially this time of year. Here, the stench of charred remains clings to everything, a constant reminder of the infected flooding in from the mainland. Dealing with the infected has become a regular chore, their bodies gathered and burned just beyond the chain-link fence near our house. Topped with menacing barbed wire loops, the fence wraps around the entire base. In theory, it's supposed to protect us from the infected during the winters when the lake freezes over. But since they now travel in large herds from the mainland, the fence alone isn't enough. Glancing over at the group, unloading the day's infected from a truck, my eyes fix on Gunner. He stands out among them, tall with tousled dark brown hair that falls carelessly over his forehead. Gunner has a reputation for being a skilled fighter, his muscles obvious even under the worn fabric of his white camouflage suit. Gunner, who's only a couple years older than me, has probably killed hundreds of infected already. People around here know him well. He's got a reputation, and not the kind you take lightly. Our only interaction happened years ago, during the worst time. It was 6 months after my mother and 4 others volunteered for a mission to gather supplies from the mainland. None of them returned. At first, we held on to hope, but as weeks turned into months, it became painfully clear they weren't coming back. While my dad sought solace at the bottom of a bottle, I threw myself into anything that needed doing. Chores, trading, I did it all. On the night of my encounter with Gunner, it was bitter cold, and the snow was coming down in thick blankets. My dad laid sprawled on the couch, lost to the world in a drunken slumber. It had become a routine of sorts. By morning, he'd already be reaching for the bottle, and by noon, he'd be in no condition to do much else. As the fire dwindled and the room grew colder, I knew I had to brave the storm for more wood. Inside our backyard shed, the air was thick with the musty scent of damp wood. I switched on my flashlight, its weak beam struggling against the dark, I remember reaching for a few logs when a sudden gust slammed the door shut behind me. The noise reverberated like a gunshot in the cramped shed, sending a shiver down my spine. Heart racing, I spun around, flashlight trembling in my grip. The beam darted around wildly before settling on a shape huddled beneath my dad's tool bench. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing off the shed's walls. Gunnar emerged slowly, towering over me by several inches. I ain't looking for trouble," he stammered, hands raised in surrender. "Just needed a place to sleep, is all." I stood there, caught off guard, like a mouse in a cat's eyes, until I noticed the darkening bruise on his left cheek. "What happened to your face?" The words spilled out of my mouth before I could stop them. Gunnar hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor, shame etching lines across his features. He didn't need to say anything. His dad, like mine, was a widowed drunk who frequented the pub, but my dad would never raise a hand to me. I couldn't even imagine it. "I can sleep on the floor. Won't even know I'm in here," he murmured, his voice thick with defeat. "No, Gunnar," I shook my head firmly. "You're not a dog. You can sleep in my dad's bed. He doesn't use it much these days." "I'll be gone by morning. You won't." "It's fine," I interrupted. "Just help me carry in some firewood and we're good." Gunnar's shoulders visibly relaxed, and he nodded silently before grabbing an armful of logs and following me back inside. I stepped toward the fire, adding more wood and watching as the flames roared to life. The warmth spread quickly, chasing away the chill from my skin. Gunnar stood there, motionless, as if lost in thought. For a while, we just listened to the crackling of the fire, the steady rhythm of my father's snores in the background. It was strange how nice it felt to have someone else there, even if that someone was Gunnar. When I finished making up the bed, Gunnar was already sitting on the edge, staring at his hands. The bruising on his cheek was darker now, a purplish stain under the dim room light. I wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. What could I even say? "I ain't trying to be a bother," Gunnar said after a while, his voice quiet. I get it. It's freezing out there." He shifted slightly, tightening his fists. "Ain't just the cold." I turned to look at him, frowning. "Your dad?" He didn't answer right away, but he didn't need to. The bruise on his face was answer enough. After a moment, he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I can't stay there no more. Not with him." I swallowed hard. "So what are you going to do?" Gunnar shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. Maybe head for the mainland. Try to find another group, or something." He sounded uncertain, like even he didn't believe in the idea. "The mainland?" I asked in disbelief. "No one goes there willingly. It's dangerous, you know that. It's dangerous here too." His words hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. He wasn't wrong. Our island wasn't safe anymore. That winter had been unusually brutal. Temperatures dropped lower than anyone could remember, and the storms never seemed to let up. The power flickered out more often than it stayed on, leaving whole parts of the base in darkness for days. Pipes froze and burst, flooding homes with freezing water. People were barely scraping by, scavenging for whatever they could find, fighting over rations. And the infected, they were getting bolder, crossing the frozen lake in larger numbers than ever before. Still, I wanted to argue, to convince him that he didn't have to leave. But I couldn't. I couldn't even promise him things would get better. "You should get some sleep," I suggested, not knowing what else to say. "Yeah," he replied, reclining on the bed with his hands clasped behind his head. I turned and walked toward the door. "Night," he said, and I paused in the doorway. "Good night," I replied softly before stepping outside and heading up to my room. When I awoke the next morning, sunlight was filtering through the thin curtains, illuminating the room in a pale, white glow. I blinked sleep from my eyes and stretched, mulling over everything that had happened the night before. When I finally entered my dad's room, I found his bed empty, the blankets neatly folded, as if Gunnar had never been there. A couple of days later, I saw Gunnar again. It was early morning, and the snow still clung to the ground in patches. He was in the driveway just outside his house, crouched beside an old, rusted truck that looked like it hadn't run in years. The hood was propped open, and he was elbow-deep in the engine, his hands stained with grease. His expression was unreadable, a brief flicker of recognition in his dark eyes before he quickly turned back to the truck. I stayed quiet, and I haven't spoken to him since. When I reach the ration building, it's already busy. A line of people stretches out the door, each holding their ration booklets like lifelines. I tuck mine deeper into my satchel, rubbing my gloved hands together as I approach the entrance. Inside, the room is filled with shelves stocked with meager supplies, cans of beans, powdered milk, some clothes, and there's a long counter where people get their ration booklets stamped in exchange for food and supplies. Behind that counter stands Jolene, my dad's girlfriend. She's wearing the same tired expression she always has, her dark hair tied back in a ponytail. Jolene's a pleasant woman, one of the few who hasn't let the world beat her down completely, but there's something distant in her eyes. We don't talk much, but she's decent to me, which is more than I can say for my dad sometimes. "Morning, Jaybird," she says when I reach the front of the line, stamping my ration booklet as I hand it over. "Morning," I mumble, glancing around the room. There's a dull buzz of conversation behind me as people shuffle forward, waiting for their turn. Jolene finishes checking me out, handing me a small bag of rations, toothpaste, a loaf of bread, some canned goods, and, surprisingly, chicken. "Listen," she says, lowering her voice slightly. "I need a favor. Gil came by earlier, said his wife's come down with something nasty. Cold, he thinks. Could you drop this off at their place?" She discreetly packs a can of soup in my bag, so no one thinks I'm getting a freebie. I nod, taking the bag from her. "Sure, I can do that. Thank you much." She offers me a small smile, which looks out of place on her exhausted face. "Be careful, okay? If she's coughing, don't hang around too long." I nod again and turn to leave. The Fuller's house isn't far, just a few streets over. I've known them all my life. They're good people, always willing to trade or help out when things get rough. When I get to their house, though, something feels off. The front door is wide open, swaying slightly in the wind. My heart sinks, and I hesitate for a moment before stepping closer. "Mr. Fuller?" I call out, my voice sounding too loud in the still air. There's no response. I inch forward, pushing the door open wider. The inside of the house is dark, with only faint sunlight filtering through the curtains. The air is heavy, stale. Something's wrong. "Mr. Fuller?" I try again, stepping into the entryway. My boots scuff against the floor as I move deeper into the house, the smell hitting me all at once. A thick, metallic scent that churns my stomach. I freeze when I see it. Mrs. Fuller is hunched over her husband's body, her back to me, but it's the sound that makes my blood run cold. A wet tearing noise, the kind that's impossible to mistake. She's eating him. For a moment I can't move. My brain struggles to process what I'm seeing. Mrs. Fuller, this kind, gentle woman, ripping chunks of flesh from her husband's corpse with her teeth. The infected, she's one of them. Before I can stop myself, a gasp escapes my throat. Mrs. Fuller's head snaps up and she turns to face me, her eyes wild and bloodshot, her mouth smeared with blood. Her lips curl into a snarl, and in a split second, she's on her feet, rushing toward me. "Shit!" I stumble back, knocking over a small table as I scramble to get away from her. She lunges at me, her hands clawing at the air, and I barely manage to throw a chair between us. The chair doesn't stop her for long. She crashes through it, splintering wood everywhere. I grab whatever I can find, an old vase, a lamp, anything, and hurl it at her as she charges. Each object slows her down, but only for a second. She's relentless, her eyes locked on me with a ravenous hunger. I dart through the narrow hallway, slamming the door to the kitchen behind me. I can hear her banging against it, her nails scratching at the wood like a rabid animal. My hands fumble as I search for something, anything to block the door. There's a heavy pan on the counter, and I grab it just as she bursts through the door. I swing it hard, the metal crashing into her head with a sickening thud. She staggers back, dazed, but it's not enough to stop her. I don't have time to think. I bolt for the front door, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I race through the house. I'm almost outside when I feel her slam into me from behind. We both hit the ground hard. I twist, trying to push her off, but she's strong. Her teeth snap inches from my face, and I can smell the rancid stench of blood on her breath. She bites into my arm, the pain searing through me like fire. I scream, kicking wildly as I try to shake her off. Her nails rake across my skin, and I can feel the warm trickle of blood running down my neck. Just when I think it's over, there's a deafening crack, and Mrs. Fuller jerks back, her body going limp. I shove her off me, gasping for air as I scrambled to my feet. Standing a few feet away is Gunnar with a rifle, his face grim. He lowers the gun, nodding at me. "You all right?" I don't answer. My whole body is shaking, my arm burning where she bit me. I look down at Mrs. Fuller's body, her eyes still wide, staring lifelessly up at the sky. Everything feels distant, unreal, like I'm watching this happen to someone else. But the pain is real, and the bite on my arm is definitely real.